Hello, my name is Sanjay. I'm now a freshman major in Management Information System.
I'm Peng Fan Ning. I'm a freshman and I majored in the Department of European Languages and Cultures.
Hi, my name is Chen Jialing. I'm from the Department of Slavic Language and Literature.
Hello everyone, my name is Xie Enqing and I'm a freshman from the Department of Business Administration. So the first question of the question number 1 is how can the lockdown of megacity in China influence the aggregate demand in China? So when we want to know how the lockdown influenced the aggregate demand, we can look at this equation first. So the 4 factor that influence the output, which is the GDP, is consumption, investment, government purchase, and net export. So first, the consumption would decrease for the 2 reasons. The first reason is because food and energy price increased, which causes people don't want to buy food and energy that much like they do before. So that caused the consumption to decrease. And the second reason is that service industry shut down because during the lockdown, no one can go outside to eat or have fun. So the service industry can't work properly. So also cause the consumption to decrease. And the net export would decrease also. For example, Shanghai has the largest port in China. And due to the lockdown, the merchandises can be exported and the raw materials can be imported. And that caused the factories around Shanghai port can produce their products well. So that also caused net export to decrease. Also, many famous international financial institutions have lowered the expected GDP growth of China. So as we can see above, we can know that the aggregate demand would decrease.
Okay, so next we'll move to the second part of the question 1. First, we'll look at the short-run cases. There are 4 components that will influence the output. First, the consumption sharply decreases, especially in service industry, including catering, tourism, and transportation. In addition, the demand in oil also reduces, which has a great impact on global oil prices. But now we just focus on the impact on China. So second, Shanghai is the leading metropolis in China. Its GDP serves as a major variable to China's GDP. And during the lockdown, lots of raw materials and components are blocked outside, which cuts down the production, and therefore the export drastically decreases. And according to data online, the gross imports and exports in Shanghai accounted for almost 30% of China's. So the lockdown might greatly influence the aggregate demand in China. And so the aggregate demand will shift to the left. And in terms of the supply, lockdown cuts down the labor supply in the production function. And in addition, due to the lack of raw materials, the cost of production gets higher, so the output falls. And the short-run aggregate supply also shift to the left, like this. Okay, so next we have 2 possible models over there. So in the short run, we have 2 possible models. And let's look at the first one. The first one, the aggregate supply and aggregate demand both will shift to the left, but the movement in aggregate supply is larger than aggregate demand. So the outcome for this one is that quantity of output will sharply fall, and the price level is slightly increases. And next, we move to the second model. So in the second short-run model, the aggregate supply and demand also decreases, but this time the aggregate demand movement is larger than the aggregate supply. So the outcome for this one is that quantity of output also have a big decrease, but the price level will fall this time. Okay, so to sum up, in short run, the quantity of output will fall, but the price level is ambiguous. So next we focus on the long run cases. This one is the previous model here. I removed the original two curves and I only remain the blue one and the green one. So in the long run, as you can see, there will be adverse shift in the short run aggregate supply on the whole, and which reduces the quantity of output and the price level goes up. So it will cause stagflation. And because of the increase in price level, firms and labor will put their expected price level higher, and therefore the nominal wages will get higher too, and which might cause the short-run aggregate supply shift left again. And in this case, there will be a wage price spiral, and this situation might get alleviated in the future when the nominal wages go down again, and in that time, short-run aggregate supply will rise. And for the second model in the long run, because of the decrease in price level, the expected price level will also go down, and accordingly, wages and prices get lower, and perceptions will change. So, which cause the short-run aggregate supply shift right. Thus, the economy will correct itself in the long run. But will a new long-run equilibrium move to point C? I think it's uncertain, but because it depends on many variables.
So I'm going to answer the third question in question number 1. The question is, in theory, what should policymakers in China do in response to the short-run economic fluctuation caused by the lockdown? So first, the government should decrease the bank reserve ratio and increase the money supply. Also, they should do the business subsidy and tax cut policy in order to help their cooperation in their country.
Okay, next I would answer the fourth part of the number 1 question. In 2021, the Taiwanese government launched the FIFO revitalization coupon, hoping to stimulate the economy and the local consumption. No matter the government gave people a casual coupon, the economic theory behind is multiplier theory, multiplier effect. For example, if the income of one person increased by $10, then he or she would spend like $8, which means the marginal propensity to consume equals to 0.8. According to the formula, the multiplier would be 5, which means that the velocity of circulation of money would increase to like 5 times. Moreover, because the coupon have a time limit to spend, the velocity would increase more. According to the formula that velocity is equal to GDP divided by quantity of money, velocity increase, quantity of money remain the same because coupons are not money, then the GDP should increase. Thus, the purpose of the Taiwanese government to launch coupons is for increasing our GDP while in the pandemic of the COVID-19.
Question number 2. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the European Union adopted a number of sanctions in an attempt to immobilize the war effort. These sanctions will have an impact on economies of the EU. So the first question is, what are these sanctions? The EU has adopted 6 packages of sanctions in response to Russia's unprecedented and unprovoked military attack against Ukraine. And the measures include individual sanctions, such as asset freezes and travel restrictions, economic sanctions, such as prohibition on imports from Russia of coal or oil. Also, restriction on media and diplomatic measures. And these measures are designed to weaken the Kremlin's ability to finance the war and also impose clear economic and political costs on Russia's political elite responsible for the invasion. Question number 2. How will they affect inflation in the EU, real GDP and unemployment? So first, let's look at the real GDP first. So here. And because the prohibition on imports from Russia of coal and oil, which is an important import, and many EU countries need the imports from Russia. So that causes the price of coal and oil to increase, and which influence the consumption. The consumption will be decreased because people don't want to buy that much coal and oil before due to the high prices. So that causes the real GDP to decrease also. So real GDP would decrease. And next, let's look at the graph here. So because the prohibition on the import of coal and oil, the aggregate supply curve would shift to the left, just like the red line here. And that causes the price level to decrease and the quantity of output also decreased. And that caused a stagflation. And the stagflation will cause the Phillips curve to shift to the right, just like the red line here. And we can see, for example, from the point A, due to the stagflation, it will move to point B, and that causes both inflation and unemployment rate to rise. So the inflation increased and the unemployment rate increased also. Question number 3. What fiscal and monetary policies will the EU have to consider to get Europe go through this crisis? So first, as the graph mentioned above, I'll draw it again here. So the aggregate supply curve will shift to the left, but they should meet at the long run aggregate supply curve. So the government would want to shift the demand curve to the right, just like the green curve. So they need to increase the aggregate demand, and that the two new lines meet at the long run aggregate supply curve. So the first method is increase money supply, which is a monetary policy. So When the government increased the money supply curve would shift to the right, which is the red line here. And that caused the interest rate to fall. And the interest rate falling would cause the increase in the quantity of goods and services demanded at a given price level. This is a given price level. So the quantity of output would increase. And that makes the aggregate demand curve shift to the right. The second method is to increase government purchase, which is a fiscal policy. So when the government alters its own purchases of goods or services, that shifts the aggregate demand curve directly. So when the government increase its purchase, the aggregate demand curve would shift to the right directly, just like this. And the last method is tax cut, which is also a fiscal policy. So when the government cuts personal income taxes, it increases households' take-home pay. And households save some of this additional income, and some of them spend some of it on the consumer goods. And the increased household spending shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So the three methods I mentioned above can fulfill the goal that we want to meet, which is to increase the aggregate demand. The last question is, do you think if the EU government can use a single policy to simultaneously solve both inflation and unemployment problems? And my answer is no, because when we look at the short-run Phillips curve, we can know that when government combats inflation, which cause inflation rate to decrease, that caused the unemployment rate to increase. So there's no a single policy to simultaneously decrease both inflation rate and unemployment rate, and which we can see why clearly in Phillips curve.
Next, I'm gonna talk about the third question. First, I'll give you an introduction about the trade war between China and the United States. In January 2018, US President Donald Trump began setting tariffs and other trade barriers on China in order to reverse the unfair position of United States in air trade. The US stated that previous trade practices enlarged trade deficits and forced the transfer of American technology to China. The total value of the product concerned above accounting for 60 billion. In response to US trade measures, the Chinese government took retaliatory actions, and the trade war escalated through 2018 and 2019. During these 2 years, they kept taking action against the other side, and they had also reached a consensus to suspend the trade war and seek reconciliation several times, but all seemed to be nothing. On December 4th, 2020, new US President Joe Biden announced that he would continue to maintain tariffs on China and will work with allies to check and balance China. On March 2021, the new representative of the Office of the United States Trade Representative said that the measures to impose tariffs on Chinese goods will not be lifted in a short period of time, but will conduct trade negotiations with China. Next, we focus on the impact on both tariff policy and capital flow. First, U.S. implemented tariff policy on China, which reduced imports. Because net exports equal exports minus imports, net export will rise. And that means the demand for dollars in the market for foreign currency exchange shift to the right, like this. And second, the foreign investment increases. 好听一下。Second, the foreign investment increases, causing net cash outflow falls. And because the demand for nominal funds equal domestic investment plus net capital outflow, so the demand shifts to the left, like this one. And net capital outflow curve shift to the right, shift to the left too. When net capital outflow moves leftward, the supply for foreign currency exchange also shift to the left. Now let's look at the final outcome. Right here, the real interest falls and the net capital outflow falls too, and the real exchange rate will increase and the net export will fall. In conclusion, decrease in real interest rates rises the domestic investment. The increase in real exchange rates means that U.S. export goods become expensive, so export will fall. 好，快什么？ For the third part, President Trump believes that the trade policy can benefit the U.S. economy because net exports of U.S. will increase. According to the above analysis, it is not the case. To put it simply, trade policy will raise the real exchange rate in the U.S. Like this. It will from the point this to E1 to point E2, and which make their goods more expensive to others. So the net export will fall instead, from this to this.
Today I'm going to answer question number 4. The first question is, what is quantitative easing policy? Quantitative easing policy is a monetary policy used by central bank like the Fed. With quantitative easing policy, a central bank purchases predetermined amounts of government bonds or other financial assets in an attempt to reduce interest rate, increase the supply of money, and drive more lending to consumers and businesses. The goal is to stimulate economic activity during a financial crisis and keep credit flowing. And what is the differences between quantitative easing policy and conventional monetary policy? Quantitative easing differs from conventional monetary policy in several key ways. First, it involves the Fed purchasing long-term treasury bonds rather than short-term treasury bills. The logic was the following. Investment spending decisions are typically based on long-term interest rate. Home mortgages, for example, have maturity up to 30 years. With traditional monetary policy, the idea is that since short-term and long-term interest rates tend to rise or fall together, lowering short-term rates will ultimately lower long-term rates and stimulate investment spending. Quantitative easing attempts to skip the middle step and directly lower long-term interest rates. And the second question is, please give one historical example to show how Fed uses the quantitative easing policy in response to a crisis or events in the United States. The coronavirus crisis in the United States triggered a deep economic downturn. The sharp contraction and deep uncertainty about the course of the virus and economy sparked a desire to hold deposit and only the most liquid assets. That disrupts the financial markets and threatened to make a dire situation much worse. So, the Fed stepped in and resumed purchasing massive amounts of debt security to keep credit flowing to limit the economic damage from the pandemic?
Later, I will put the introduction of the European sovereign debt crisis and how did it happen into one answer. The origin of the sovereign debt crisis basically stemmed from the false confidence of the countries outside the Eurozone in some of the countries like PIGs, like Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, and later I will just simply call them pigs. Yeah. And they are all in Eurozone too. Yeah. The pigs would have a very low government bond yield because countries in the Eurozone share the same credit at least before the 2008 occurs in financial crisis. When the capital is enough, these countries can issue new bonds to pay off the old bonds. However, in the financial crisis in 2008, these bonds were no longer to be able to be paid because actually the debtors of the pigs countries are almost from the core country of the Eurozone, like France or Germany, and especially Germany. Because of the financial crisis in 2008, the original debtors started to sell the assets which were from pigs countries, and at that time the economy was actually in a depression because of the financial crisis. The situation was like no taxes and no bonds to be issued. The credit of pigs suddenly contracted because the debt was not paid off. Then the interest rate started to soar. At that time, the real estate bubbles of Spain and Ireland started to burst, leading to a great amount of bad debt in a country. The governments of Spain and Italy had to save the country, but or the bank or have a bankruptcy. Yeah, but they can't print money because all the countries in the Eurozone shared euro, so they can print euro by themselves. From 2009, one of the countries in pigs, which is Greece, started to have lots of financial crises, like financial fraud, which had hit lots of deficit of GDP and debt in Greece. At that time, not only did Greece have a financial crisis, many countries with weaker financial power all have similar problems, like Portugal, Italy, and Spain, basically pigs. Yeah. EU and the EU is European Union and G20 even asked the private banks, which were also the debtors of the Greece, to take on like 50% of the debt, which means that Greece were not really in the breach of the contract. But that makes the credit rating of 9 countries in Eurozone in S&P dropped. So actually the whole economy was facing collapse. Then after a series of torment, they finally came out with a solution named ESM, which is a European stability mechanism, helping the pigs country pay off their debt. Let's get into the second part of the number 5 question. In this part, I will simply separate the answer into 2 parts. One is for the analysis for the pigs country, which is for Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. And the other part of the answer, I would analyzing the core country of the Eurozone, and here I will use Germany for example. I will separate the answer into 2 parts because in the European sovereign debt crisis, the relationship between pigs and the core country is almost like debtors and the creditors. So the situation between them would almost an opposite situation. So here I would answer the questions. In the beginning of the European sovereign debt crisis, the capital in the pig's country would flow back to their original countries, which means that the net capital outflow equals to net foreign investment equal to net exports will sharply increase. It is not because pig's country have extra money to invest. It is because the money is original owned by the core countries of the Eurozone. So now just the capital flow back to their own country. So here we could see the point is get to the here, and that will lead the supply curve of the market of the loanable funds and peaks would shift to the right, and we could see that will lead to the real interest rate real interest rate will decrease, and that will also lead to the supply curve of the market of the foreign currency exchanged in peaks will shift to the right. Okay. The other side of the European sovereign debt crisis is the core countries like Germany. And okay, here we could see the net capital outflow will sharply decrease. And that is because the original capital invest to the pig's country would flow back to their own country. So the net foreign investment or net export would be sharply decreased, and we could see that will lead to the supply curve of the market of the loanable funds in Germany would also sharply shift to the left, and the real interest rate here would also increase, and we could see the supply curve of the market of the foreign currency exchanged in Germany or core countries in the Eurozone would also shift to the left, and we could see the real exchange rate increase here. Next, I would answer the third part of the number 5 question. In Eurozone, the safest country is Germany. So when there is a financial crisis, the money would automatically flow into the safest Germany. And actually, the debtors of the pig's country are almost from Germany. So despite the fact that it seems that it was Germany helping the pig's country to get through the financial crisis, Germany actually took the advantage of the whole European Union to get through its own financial crisis with a very strict ESM for pigs that I mentioned in the second part of the number 5 question. And Germany just took this time to get their money back from the pig's country, and that is how I think Germany got benefit from these financial crises.